delighted to be here with you this evening. Bill gave away my opening line, which is the fact that I'm Canadian. And I must say, to me as a Canadian, this is a very strange holiday we're celebrating. Constitution Day. Where I'm from in Canada, I'm fairly sure that if you walked around the country and asked Canadians about the Constitution's birthday, I suspect many might not even know that Canada has a Constitution. I was born there, grew up there, I studied political science, did an undergraduate degree and a master's, and I have no idea what the opening words of the Canadian Constitution are. I don't even know how many articles there are. Now that said, if you were to ask a Canadian, or a Frenchman, or a Swede, or a Belgian, or anyone about their national holiday, that would make perfect sense. Right here in America, the 4th of July doesn't need any explanation, right? We understand what it means. On the 4th of July, 1776, we declared our independence and justified the principles that allowed us to do so. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why then another holiday for the Constitution? If we already have the 4th of July, why do we need a second holiday? Now normally, I wouldn't point out the shortcomings of the Declaration of Independence. But today, or more specifically, tomorrow is Constitution Day. We celebrate the Constitution. Therefore, I feel that it's okay to point out what is missing in the Declaration of Independence that justifies having a separate holiday for the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence contains what I think is the clearest, most concise articulation of the principles that define this country: natural rights, equality, liberty, and government by consent. But while it gets the principles right, it offers very little guidance on how to implement them. It leaves unanswered the most important practical question: how do you take these general, abstract, theoretical ideals and build a real government out of it? After all, it's pretty easy to declare rights. Countless crackpot dictatorships have done so. It's very easy to put out a piece of paper saying, we believe in these rights and we believe in these rights. If you want to get a kick, when you go home, Google the Syrian Constitution and take a look at the rights that are proclaimed in there. It's much harder to establish a government that actually respects and secures these rights. Let me put it to you differently. There's nothing special about the fact that we had a war of independence. So we got rid of Great Britain, but you know what? Many other countries had wars of independence. The Chinese, or had revolutionary wars. The Chinese did, the French did, the Russians did. And how did that work out for them? What sorts of governments came out of the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, or the French Revolution? The real difficulty is not to win your freedom. It's to order it. It is, in the words of the Constitution, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. This is where most countries fail. And we should know, because the first time we took a crack at it, we failed. Does anybody remember or know the name of our first Constitution? The Articles of Confederation. So from 1781 to 1789, when the current Constitution came into effect, we had a first Constitution. And it was pretty much a fiasco. If you read Federalist Papers 2 to 14, it'll give you a pretty solid indictment of the Articles of Confederation. In short, it created a very weak government that couldn't keep us safe and prevented the states from misbehaving. And so we get our Constitution, hatched one summer in Philadelphia in 1787, and finalized on September 17th, i.e. that's why tomorrow is Constitution Day. Thomas Jefferson called it unquestionably the wisest constitution ever yet presented to men. 227 years later, it remains to this day the oldest written national constitution still in continuous use. The Constitution of the state of Massachusetts, it's older, but that's a state constitution, it's not a national one. It's also the most distinctively American of our founding documents. The Declaration of Independence has John Locke written all over it. The Constitution, by contrast, is a distinctively American document. You don't find a precedent for it in the writings of European political philosophers. It is our great contribution to Western civilization. The Greeks gave the world philosophy. The Italians gave the world opera. We gave the world the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the modern Republican theory of government, Republican small r. And so, for all these reasons, our Constitution deserves a national holiday that is distinct from our Day of Independence. And that's why we celebrate tomorrow Constitution Day. It did take Congress a little while to get around to it. It was only proclaimed a national holiday in 2004, but September 17th from here onward is Constitution Day. The question I want to take up tonight is it a holiday for all Americans? We are, after all, a deeply divided nation on all political issues. There are red states and there are blue states, and purple states are becoming an endangered species. There is a Republican Party and there's a Democratic Party. And if you take the most conservative member of the Democratic Party, that person is still more liberal than the most liberal person of the GOP. There's MSNBC and there's Fox News, and boy, do they not see eye to eye. So which side is the Constitution on? Is it pro-gay marriage or pro-traditional marriage? Is it in favor of high taxes or low taxes? What does it say about immigration and foreign policy and marijuana? What's the answer? Nothing. The Constitution does not prescribe any particular policies. It's largely agnostic when it comes to policy. The Constitution is a small d democratic document that puts us, the people, in charge and allows us, through our elected representatives, to govern ourselves as we see fit. All that the Constitution is a framework for a free people to govern themselves and to confront the political questions of their time. What do you begin with? With the free people, a self-governing people, we the people. And like all people, we have personal issues that we need to deal with, but then we have political questions that we need to confront as a political community. And therefore, we need a framework for doing so. And that's what the Constitution is. What we decide is always up to us. How we go about arriving at that decision, that's what the Constitution maps out. It basically lays down the rules of the game. And the players then can go left, they can go right, they can go up, they can go down. All they need to do is to follow the rules of the game. In that sense, in this fundamental sense, the Constitution is neither liberal, nor conservative, nor libertarian. It can accommodate pretty much anything that the people want, within certain important limits, of course. Let me give you 3 examples. 1 pertaining to foreign policy, and 2 pertaining to domestic policy. I take it some of you have heard what's going on in Syria with ISIS. Right? ISIS has set up an Islamic caliphate in parts of Syria and in Iraq. They're murdering the local population, they're threatening our allies, and they've already beheaded 2 American journalists. What do? The Constitution doesn't say. You know what it does say? It says that the president is in charge of foreign policy and of the military. That he needs to make a decision. He is the point man on this question. If he wants to declare war, he needs to go through Congress. Aside from that, the Constitution doesn't say. It says that one of our elected representatives, in this case the President of the United States of America, is in charge. Immigration. We've got millions of illegal immigrants in America, and many more coming in every day. Some of them came here at a very young age, they only speak English, they're Americans for all intents and purposes. What do? The Constitution doesn't say. You know what it does say? It says that Congress, not the President, not the governors, not the Supreme Court, has the power to, quote, establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Our Congress in Washington, D.C. needs to deliberate on the issue and address it as they see fit. Let me give you a last example, education. Our K-12 system is a mess. We spend more money than any other country in the world on education, and our test scores are far from inspiring. Across the country, kids are trapped in failing schools. What do, according to the Constitution? Well, according to the Constitution, there is no we. There are 50 we's, which are then divided in, I think, to about 13,000 school districts. And it is up to each we, each state, to figure out what it wants to do with its school system. You'll notice that in each case, Syria, immigration, education, I could give you many more. The Constitution doesn't tell you what to do. It only says who is tasked with doing it. And it's the same thing with pretty much any issue you can think of, from drugs to the death penalty. The Constitution is all about process. And the process it lays out is a very straightforward one. The fundamental constitutional question when an issue pops up is this a national issue? This is if you want to think constitutionally, this is the first question you need to ask yourselves. According to the Constitution, most issues are going to be dealt with at the state and local level. Why? Because this is a very big country. There are 300 million people and it spans an entire continent. And you cannot expect a one-size-fits-all approach to policy. You cannot expect us to agree as a people on everything. That's why the Constitution says, look, there are certain core issues where we need to agree, like immigration or foreign policy. You can't have the state of Florida declare war on Venezuela while the state of Alabama signs a peace treaty with Venezuela at the same time. That's not possible. On certain core issues, look at Article 1, Section 8. 17 specific areas are given to Congress. We need to speak in one voice. And what the Constitution says is that on every other issue, we get to speak in 50 different voices, if not in hundreds of different voices, because it's not always clear that an issue has to be dealt with at the state level. It may be dealt with at the local level, and in certain cases, it may not be a political issue, period. And people can deal with it as they see fit individually. So think of it this way. Unless the Constitution says that Congress is allowed to deal with an issue, it isn't. And it's pretty much the opposite with the states. Unless it specifically forbids them from dealing with an issue, they're allowed to deal with them. So according to the Constitution, what you are going to have is a core set of national issues where you need to have agreement, and then spectacular diversity and variety on everything else. You're going to have red states, you're going to have blue states, and the key thing is you're going to allow people to move in between them. What the Constitution does, the genius of federalism, is not that it secures states' rights. I hate that word. States don't have rights. Human beings have rights. States have powers. What's wonderful about federalism is that it creates competition between governments for you, for your residency, for your taxes. It forces them to say, hey, come live in my state because of the following reasons. It forces them to try to better themselves on your behalf. Something that ends up being inevitably absent wherever you have a monopoly. So it breaks up the government monopoly. And then it says on these issues, whether they be at the national level or at the state level, the people can pretty much do anything they want within certain limits. So there's a Bill of Rights. There's a 14th Amendment. There's an Article 1, Section 9 and an Article 1, Section 10, which says that certain things are unacceptable. So for example, neither Congress nor the states can pass an ex post facto law. You can't pass a law that says that something that was legal 5 years ago is now illegal retroactively. You're not allowed to do that. But within these delineations, with these few exceptions, the Constitution essentially says the people, via their elected representatives, are in charge. And it just maps out a set of rules for them to decide on issues. That's it. It is always up to us. Times change, issues flare up, and then they disappear. Science continues to deliver wonders, but the constitutional framework endures. What I'd like to end on is by suggesting to you that the right way to approach the Constitution today is not in terms of conservative, liberal, libertarian, I'm pro-marijuana legalization, I'm pro-high taxes. That's not the way to look at it. The real issue from a constitutional point of view today is whether or not you're going to abide by the rules of the Constitution. You see, what we've essentially done over the past century is we've built up an administrative state that operates outside of the strictures of the Constitution. When I used to teach principles of American politics to undergraduate students, I would tell them rather bluntly, but this is correct in my estimation, that if you want to understand the government we have today in Washington, D.C., if you were in my capital and I wasn't in yours, and you wanted to understand how things work, I would not recommend you read the Constitution. It's not particularly helpful. The Federalist Papers are not going to help you very much in understanding what's happening today in D.C. I would give my students an ATV analogy. Imagine that America is one big forest, and the Constitution is the network of roads that we've mapped out in this country. You can go left, you can go right, you can go up, you can go down, you can turn around, you can go around in circles. You can do whatever you want. What you're not allowed to do is to go off-roading. And what we've been doing, all three branches of government have been off-roading when it comes to the Constitution. I'd like to give you an example from each of the three branches. I'll begin with what is the easiest one. I think most people instinctively realize that the Supreme Court goes outside of its limits occasionally. It's called judicial activism. Now, judicial activism is not, oh, I really like this law, and then the Supreme Court struck it down, and I don't like that decision. It has nothing to do with policy preferences. It has to do with the court either subverting the meaning of the words of the Constitution or of plain laws, or judging laws according to extra-constitutional standards. Let me give you an example. Has anybody heard of the 2005 Supreme Court decision, Kelo versus the City of New London? Look it up if you have time. It's a rather, the type of thing that makes you say in disbelief, how could this happen in America? So there's the City of New London in Connecticut that is approached by a developer that says, we want to redevelop this neighborhood called New Trumbull. What's the problem? Well, people are actually living there right now. It's not an abandoned neighborhood. So what does the city say? Well, we're going to force them to sell to you. We're going to invoke the Fifth Amendment. What does the Fifth Amendment say? That private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. So if I force you, Bill, to sell your house to me because I want to build a highway there, I need to compensate you. What's the problem? A developer building condos is not public use. It's private use. One lady had her house taken away from her. She sued. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and she lost. The plain words of the Constitution said, no private property shall be taken for public use without just compensation. And the court, in effect, said, well, public use, private use, same diff. Now, it's not just the courts that misbehave. You see that happening in the White House, too. Presidents in America have a tendency to forget that they run the executive branch, that their job is to execute laws, not to make laws or to amend laws or to channel the will of the American people and to say, well, these are the laws they would be voting for if Congress weren't so darn hard to deal with. The current occupant of the White House has had a particularly bad record in this regard. So, for example, last summer, President Obama's Department of Homeland Security issued a memorandum saying, from here onward, we will not prosecute or deport anyone who came here at a young age illegally. So if you're 34 years old today, you were brought here at the age of 6, we're now saying, even though according to the laws on the books that were passed by Congress and that a previous president signed, we are entitled to prosecute you, we're not going to do that. I want to be clear about something. The issue here is not what do you do about these young people who came here at a young age. That's not the question. The question is, who does it? The Constitution clearly stipulates that laws get made and the president is tasked with enforcing them. Now, it goes without saying that the president cannot enforce every last law on the book all the time. You can't prosecute every single criminal in America. You need to use a little bit of discretion. That said, you're not allowed to unilaterally amend laws on the grounds that Congress didn't pass the law you wanted them to pass. In this case, the DREAM Act. The worst offender, though, are not the courts, and it's not the White House, but it's Congress. And in this regard, both parties are absolutely guilty of this. So this is not a case where you think that the Republicans are good and the Democrats are bad, or vice versa. I could go on at great length about what they do, but what I'd like to focus your attention on are their two main gross violations of the Constitution. Number one, as a rule of thumb, all Congresses, Republican, Democratic, divided, there is no issue that isn't a national issue for them. There is no such thing as Article 1, Section 8, which stipulates only these areas are to be dealt with by Congress. The very first words of Article 1, all legislative powers herein granted, i.e. only these legislative powers herein granted is Congress allowed to deal with, that doesn't exist. If there's a problem in America, if someone is suffering, Congress says, we need to act. One great example of this is education. And as I said, this happens with both parties. So under President Bush and a Republican-dominated House, we got No Child Left Behind. And under President Obama and a Democratic-controlled Congress, we got the Common Core. Same logic in each case. Every issue is a national issue. The other thing they do that Congress loves to do is to delegate their legislative powers to the bureaucracy. So something is happening in America, there's an issue, and Congress says, we need to act, let's do something. And they pass a law. Now, it's not a law the way you and I would imagine a law to be, i.e. a piece of paper that says, do this, don't do that, and if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. It's these 2,000-page behemoths that are filled with this broad aspirational language that are saying, we need to make the air cleaner. We need to make America a wonderful place to live in. And then you pass the buck to the agencies and you tell them, you go ahead and fill in the blanks. You draft the actual regulations that will then become the law. So you remember the whole kerfuffle recently over the contraceptive mandate in Obamacare? Again, I don't care where you stand on the matter, but do you realize that this was not in the actual law of Obamacare? This is a regulation that was issued by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And this, of course, is a win-win situation for Congress, because Congress gets to tell the American people, we acted. We addressed the issue. And then the regulations start coming out. You call your congressman, you know what they tell you? Well, that's not my fault. It's those damn bureaucrats in the APA, in HHS. You pick the agency. We did something, and now they're putting out these regulations. It's an outrage. They get to take credit for the legislation being passed, and they pass the blame on the agencies that are actually writing the laws, because that's what Congress asked them to do. I could give you thousands of examples. I'll give you one from the Bush years to make clear that this is a bipartisan problem. Anybody remember TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program? So this is a 200-page law that was passed after the financial meltdown in September of 2008. And it sets up a pot of $750 billion. And it doesn't say, well, this is how we're going to spend it because we, the members of Congress, have been tasked by the American people with governing and they voted for us and not for someone else. No. It gives the Secretary of the Treasury essentially carte blanche to spend the money as he sees fit. It says that the Secretary is authorized to, quote, purchase troubled assets from any financial institution on such terms and conditions as are to be determined by the Secretary, not by Congress. And that the Secretary can also, quote, take such actions as the Secretary deems necessary to carry out the authorities of this act. So what they're in effect saying is, sir, you're the Secretary, here are $750 billion. You use them to buy troubled assets and to do whatever you think is necessary. We're not going to ask any questions. This is us legislating. So I'm not even going to point out the fact that nowhere in the Constitution there's a spending clause, there's a troubled assets buying clause. I won't say a word about that. I just would like you to realize what just happened. You give this pot of money to an unelected member of government and you say, go ahead and spend it as you see fit. Is it any surprise that 3 months after this law was passed, they invoked TARP to do the auto bailouts? TARP was passed for financial institutions, and they invoked it, and President Bush signed this into law to bail out the auto companies. This is essentially lawlessness. Congress takes a pot of money, hands it out, and says, go ahead and have fun. Here are some broad guidelines on what you ought to do. I'd like to leave you with a thought tonight before we open it up for questions. When we think about our history as a country, the history that we read about in books, that we see in documentaries, and that they teach us in our schools, both the K-12 system and in our universities, it's always presented as the story of the democratic march forward, small d democratic. In the beginning, few Americans voted, and few Americans were in office. And over the course of our great 2-century history, and a few decades, more and more Americans were brought into the political process. And we allowed women and minorities to vote, and now we have men and minorities who have been elected and appointed to some of the highest offices in the country. This is absolutely true, and it's one of the great successes of our country. This is the part of the story that we all know, the democratic march forward. What we aren't told, what doesn't get emphasized, and what I would encourage you to think about, is that as our democracy has become more and more inclusive, which is a good thing, our government, regrettably, has become less and less democratic. More and more people vote, but their vote matters less and less. Why? Because ever greater parts of the government are effectively operating outside of the electoral mechanisms of the Constitution. That we've got this parallel universe where on the one hand we vote, we have elections, we have people who represent us, and then on the other hand there is something called the administrative state, the fourth branch of government, which is on autopilot and which is largely unaffected by elections. This is the real constitutional question today. So I would urge you, as a foreigner who is not a citizen of this great country but hopes to become one day, that when it comes to these issues, we should set aside our partisan differences. When it comes to the Constitution, there should be no Republicans and no Democrats, no liberals, no conservatives, no libertarians, no pro-taxes, no pro-marijuana, no pro-marriage, you name it. And we should all agree that what matters is that the people have a government that represents their voices and operates within a constitutional framework. Thank you.